Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. Close your eyes and imagine a world where beauty itself could be dangerous, where being too lovely, too perfect, too captivating could doom you to a fate more tragic than being ordinary ever could. In the realm of ancient Greek mythology, there lived a mortal whose appearance was so breathtaking that it made the goddess of love herself forget her divine nature and fall with the helpless intensity of any mortal woman who has ever lost her heart completely. This is the story of Adonis and Aphrodite, a tale that explains why roses blush red, why windflowers bloom so briefly, and why the Greeks believed that true beauty and true tragedy were forever intertwined. It's a story that begins not with love, but with vanity, moves through forbidden desire and divine jealousy, and ends in a hunting ground stained with blood that would become flowers. This is a myth about the price of perfection, the vulnerability of even gods when they love, and the eternal truth that the most beautiful things in life are often the most fleeting. The ancient Greeks told this story to make sense of the changing seasons, to understand why winter strips the world bare and spring brings it back to life. But beneath the surface, this is a story about something far more human than agricultural cycles. It's about a love so powerful that it transcended the boundary between divine and mortal, a passion so intense that it literally changed the landscape, leaving its mark in flowers that still grow today as living monuments to grief and devotion. Adonis was said to be the most beautiful man who ever lived, not just handsome in the way that makes heads turn or hearts flutter with passing attraction, but beautiful with the kind of otherworldly perfection that seemed to prove the divine must have had a hand in his creation. His features were so finely sculpted, they might have been carved by the gods themselves from living marble. His form possessed that rare balance of strength and grace that artists spend lifetimes trying to capture. When he moved, it was as if beauty itself had learned to walk among mortals. And when he smiled, even the cynical and the bitter found themselves believing, just for a moment, that the world might be a more perfect place than they had thought. But Adonis was not born from joy or purity. His very existence was the result of a curse, a punishment, a grandmother's pride, and a mother's unspeakable shame. To understand how the most beautiful love story in Greek mythology came to be, we must first descend into one of its darkest and most disturbing chapters. We must begin with Mira, and the terrible revenge of an offended goddess. The curse that started it all, Mira's forbidden desire. In the kingdom of Cyprus, there ruled a king named Cinyras, a man known for his wealth, his musical talent, and his pride. He was married to Queen Centraeus, and together they had a daughter named Mira, sometimes called Smyrna, in different tellings of this myth. The girl grew into a young woman of exceptional beauty, blessed with flowing hair the color of polished wood, eyes that sparkled like amber catching light, and a face that drew admiration wherever she went. Now, a sensible parent might have been quietly grateful for a beautiful daughter, and taught her humility along with how to manage the inevitable attention such beauty brings. But Cinyras and Centraeus were not sensible in this regard. They were proud, perhaps too proud, and Centraeus made a fatal mistake that would echo through generations. In her maternal pride, she began to boast that her daughter Mira was more beautiful than Aphrodite herself, the goddess of love and beauty, she who was born from sea foam and whose very presence could make flowers bloom and hearts race with desire. To claim a mortal surpassed Aphrodite in beauty was more than mere bragging. It was hubris of the highest order, a direct challenge to a goddess whose domain was beauty itself. Aphrodite heard these boasts, as gods always seem to hear when mortals speak too boldly of themselves, and she was not pleased at all. The goddess of love could be generous and kind to those who honored her properly, but she could also be vengeful when her pride was wounded. And Centraeus had wounded it deeply. But Aphrodite's revenge was not direct. She did not strike down the mother who had made the boast, nor did she simply disfigure the daughter who was the subject of it. No, Aphrodite's punishment was far more creative and far more cruel than simple destruction. She decided to punish Mira in a way that would destroy her from the inside out. That would make the girl wish for death, while simultaneously making death impossible to achieve with any honor. Aphrodite cursed Mira with a desire so forbidden, so unnatural, so completely opposed to every law of gods and men, that its mere existence was an abomination. She made Mira fall in love with her own father, not the innocent love a daughter naturally feels for a father, but passionate, consuming, erotic love. The kind of desire that makes sleep impossible and food tasteless, that fills every waking moment with longing and every dream with images that should never exist. Mira found herself burning with lust for Cinyras, imagining things no daughter should imagine, wanting things no daughter should want, and all the while knowing that what she felt was monstrous, unnatural, an offense against every natural law. The poor girl suffered in silence for as long as she could. She tried to fight the curse, tried to push the terrible thoughts away, tried to focus on the suitors who came seeking her hand in legitimate marriage. But Aphrodite's curse was not something that could be overcome by willpower. It consumed Mira like a fire, growing stronger rather than weaker with time, until she could think of nothing else. She became hollow-eyed and pale, barely eating, barely speaking, moving through her days like a ghost. When her father asked her what kind of husband she desired, hoping to arrange a suitable marriage that might restore her spirits, Mira looked at him with eyes full of tortured longing and whispered, "One like you, Father, a man like you." Cinyras, innocent of the true meaning behind her words, was touched by what he interpreted as a daughter's pure affection. He thought her modest and dutiful, wanting a husband who possessed her father's good qualities. He had no idea that the words were literal, that his daughter was telling him exactly what she meant. The agony became too much to bear. Mira decided that if she could not have what her cursed heart desired, she would at least escape the torment. Late one night, she fashioned a noose from her belt and prepared to hang herself from the rafters of her chamber. She had the rope around her neck, was ready to step off into the darkness that would end her suffering, when her old nurse, who had cared for her since infancy, happened to enter the room and discovered what was happening. The nurse cut Mira down and held her as she wept. And gradually, haltingly, the girl confessed the terrible truth of her desire. Some versions say the nurse was horrified, but ultimately pitied her charge too much to abandon her. Other versions suggest the nurse was more practical than moral, willing to help find a solution to any problem, no matter how unconventional. Either way, the nurse hatched a plan that was as clever as it was terrible. It happened that the festival of Demeter was approaching, a celebration that required married women to abstain from their husbands' beds for 9 nights. Queen Centrais would be away from the royal bedchamber, participating in these rituals. The nurse went to King Cinyras and told him of a young woman, noble and beautiful, who had conceived a desperate passion for him. She described the girl only in vague terms, mentioning her youth and beauty, noting that she was the same age as Mira, but never revealing her identity. She promised to bring this mysterious admirer to him if he was interested. Cinyras, perhaps flattered, perhaps bored with his wife away for 9 nights, perhaps simply curious, agreed. And so the nurse, under cover of complete darkness, brought Mira to her father's bedchamber. The room was kept utterly black, not a single lamp or candle burning, so that Cinyras could not see who shared his bed. For several nights, this continued. Father and daughter lay together in the darkness, neither seeing the other, Cinyras believing he entertained a beautiful stranger, Mira finally satisfying the terrible desire that Aphrodite's curse had planted in her heart. But curiosity eventually overcame Cinyras. On one of the later nights, he brought a lamp into the chamber, waited until his mysterious lover slept, and then lit it to see her face. The light revealed Mira lying beside him, and in that terrible instant, Cinyras understood everything. The horror and disgust that crashed over him were so powerful that he could not even speak at first. Then he found his voice and roared in rage and revulsion. He drew his sword, fully intending to kill his daughter for the abomination they had committed together, even though he had been an unknowing participant in the sin. Mira fled into the night, running through the palace and out into the world beyond, with her father's curses and the sound of his pursuing footsteps echoing behind her. She ran and ran, through fields and forests, across hills and valleys, while her belly swelled with the product of that unholy union. She was pregnant with her father's child, carrying shame and new life together inside her, and she knew there was nowhere in the civilized world where she could go. She was a monster in the eyes of everyone who would learn what she had done, unfit to live among decent people. For 9 months, she wandered in exile, growing heavier with child, until finally, exhausted beyond endurance, she collapsed in a lonely place far from any human settlement. She had fled from death only to find a slower, lonelier end in the wilderness. In her desperation, she prayed to the gods, not for forgiveness, because she knew what she had done was unforgivable, but for release. She begged them to remove her from the world in such a way that she would offend neither the living nor the dead. She was not fit to walk among mortals, but neither did she deserve a place in the afterlife. She asked to simply cease to exist, to be transformed into something that was neither alive nor dead, neither human nor spirit. The gods, perhaps moved by pity, or perhaps simply finding the request reasonable given her circumstances, granted her prayer. As she lay there in her exhaustion, her skin began to harden and split. Her arms stretched upward and separated into branches. Her fingers elongated into twigs. Her legs grew down into the earth, becoming roots. Her hair became leaves, and her tears transformed into sap. Where Myrrha had been, there now stood a tree, the myrrh tree, forever weeping fragrant resin that would be prized as incense and medicine, her tears given purpose, even though she herself had been erased from human form. But the child inside her had not been transformed. The baby still grew in the heart of the tree. And when the time came for birth, the tree's trunk split open. Some versions say a wild boar wandered past and struck the tree with its tusks, causing it to crack. Others say the tree itself opened in response to the movements of the child within. However it happened, from within that wooden womb emerged a baby boy, perfect and beautiful beyond description. The nymphs of the forest, taking pity on this innocent child, born of such a dark lineage, gathered him up. They washed him in the tears of his mother that still dripped as myrrh from the tree. They wrapped him in soft leaves and blessed him with their own magic, trying to give him a clean start despite the circumstances of his Isa conception. And they named him Adonis, which means Lord in the ancient Phoenician language, as if even then they sensed that this child would be special, that his beauty would command a kind of devotion usually reserved for divinity. This was the child who would grow to be the most beautiful mortal who ever lived. This was the boy who would capture the heart of the goddess of love herself. His very existence was born from curse and tragedy, from divine revenge and human weakness, from unspeakable acts and the transformation of horror into something new. Perhaps that made him perfect for Aphrodite, who was herself born from an act of violence when Cronus castrated his father Uranus and threw the severed genitals into the sea, from which Aphrodite emerged. Both of them, in their way, were born from trauma, transformed into beauty. Perhaps that's why they understood each other. Perhaps that's why their love, when it came, felt inevitable. The infant who captured divine hearts. Aphrodite happened upon the myrrh tree not long after Adonis was born. She was wandering through the forests, as she sometimes did when she wanted to escape the intrigues and drama of Mount Olympus, when she heard an infant crying. Following the sound, she discovered the baby lying on soft moss where the nymphs had placed him, wrapped in leaves, his tiny face scrunched up with the universal distress of a hungry newborn. The moment Aphrodite looked at him, she was struck by his beauty. Even as an infant, there was something extraordinary about him. His features, though still baby-soft and unformed, held the promise of exceptional beauty to come. But it was more than that. There was something about him, some quality that seemed to recognize divinity when it came near, that responded to her presence by becoming calm and turning his eyes toward her face with the absolute trust that only the very young possess. Aphrodite picked him up, and the baby stopped crying. She held him against her chest and felt her heart contract with an unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't love, not yet, not romantic love anyway. The child was an infant, after all, and even Aphrodite wasn't that twisted. But it was something protective and tender, a desire to keep this beautiful thing safe, to see what he would become when he grew. She had no idea who his parents were, no knowledge of the dark story of his conception. She only knew that he was alone, that he was beautiful, and that she wanted him. But Aphrodite was not maternal by nature. She was the goddess of love and desire, not of childbirth or child-rearing. Those were other goddesses' domains. She had responsibilities on Olympus and among mortals, affairs to oversee and interventions to make in the love lives of gods and humans alike. She couldn't spend years raising a mortal child, no matter how beautiful he might become. She needed someone else to care for him, someone who would keep him safe until he grew to an age where his beauty could be properly appreciated. She thought of Persephone, queen of the underworld. Persephone spent half the year below the earth with her husband Hades, presiding over the realm of the dead. She was powerful, trustworthy, and importantly, she lived far away from the other gods and their jealous eyes. If Aphrodite left the child with Persephone, he would be protected, hidden away from anyone who might harm him or claim him for themselves. And when he was grown, Aphrodite would come back for him. So Aphrodite wrapped the baby Adonis in fine cloth and placed him in an ornate chest, the kind used to store precious things. She carried this chest down into the underworld, navigating the paths that led through darkness to the palace of Hades and Persephone. She found the queen of the dead in her throne room, surrounded by the gray light that passes for illumination in that sunless realm, and presented her with the chest. "I have a favor to ask," Aphrodite said, using all her charm and beauty to make the request appealing. "I need you to keep this safe for me for a while, just until the child inside grows a bit older. Then I'll come back for him." Persephone agreed without opening the chest. How could she refuse Aphrodite, who was one of the few gods who still visited her in the underworld, who brought news and gossip from the surface world that Persephone missed during her months below? She agreed to guard whatever was in the chest and set it aside in her private chambers, thinking no more about it for the moment. But curiosity eventually overcame her. Days, or perhaps weeks later, Persephone opened the chest to see what was so precious that Aphrodite needed it guarded in the underworld. She expected jewels, perhaps, or some magical artifact. What she found was Adonis, now a toddler, looking up at her with enormous eyes, and the kind of beauty that made even the queen of the dead catch her breath. Time moves strangely in the underworld, not quite the same as it does in the world above. Adonis grew there under Persephone's care, and as he grew, he became more and more beautiful. His baby features refined themselves into perfect proportions. His toddler awkwardness gave way to the grace of childhood. Persephone fed him the food of the underworld, not the pomegranate seeds that had bound her to Hades, but other fare, and she found herself growing attached to this beautiful boy who brought something like life into her realm of death. She dressed him in fine clothes and gave him a room in the palace. She taught him games and stories, showed him the strange wonders of the underworld, the fields of asphodel where ordinary souls wandered, the rivers with their various properties, the judges who weighed the deeds of the dead. Adonis was the only living child in that entire realm, and his presence transformed it somehow, made it feel less like a tomb and more like a place where life was merely resting before renewal. Years passed, and Adonis grew from child to youth to young man, and what a young man he became. His beauty, which had been remarkable as a child, became absolutely breathtaking as he matured. His face could have been used as a template for masculine perfection. His body was strong and lithe, muscled from the exercises Persephone had him perform to stay healthy in that dark realm, but not overdeveloped. He moved with unconscious grace. His voice, when he spoke, was warm and pleasant to hear. His smile could light up even the gloom of the underworld. Persephone found her feelings changing. This was no longer a child in her care. This was a man, beautiful beyond imagining. And she was a goddess who had spent far too long in the company of the dead and her grim husband, Hades. She began to see Adonis not as a ward, but as a potential lover. She started to desire him with an intensity that surprised her. She who had been kidnapped and forced into marriage with the god of death. She who spent half her year longing for the sunlit world above, found herself not wanting to let this beautiful mortal out of her sight. Then, one day, Aphrodite returned. The goddess of love descended into the underworld, expecting to find the baby she had left years ago, now grown to perhaps boyhood, ready to be taken back to the surface world. What she found, instead, was Adonis as a young man in his full prime, so beautiful that Aphrodite, who had seen every form of beauty the world had to offer, who was herself the living embodiment of attraction, felt her breath catch and her heart begin to race. "I've come to take him back," Aphrodite said to Persephone, her eyes never leaving Adonis. "As we agreed, you were only keeping him for me until he was grown." Persephone's expression hardened. "No," she said flatly. "I have raised him. I have cared for him all these years. He is mine now. You left him as a baby and forgot about him. You have no right to take him. I left him in your care temporarily," Aphrodite insisted, her voice taking on an edge. "He was always meant to return to the world above. He is immortal. He belongs in the sunlight, not in this realm of shadows." "He is happy here," Persephone countered. "He knows no other home. You cannot simply come after all these years and claim him like a piece of property left at a neighbor's house." The argument escalated. Two goddesses, both powerful, both accustomed to getting their way, both now in love with the same mortal man, stood in the throne room of the underworld and fought over him. Adonis himself stood between them, bewildered and perhaps a bit frightened, looking from one to the other as they argued over his fate without seeming to consider his own wishes in the matter. It became clear that neither goddess would back down. Persephone refused to surrender Adonis, and Aphrodite refused to leave without him. The dispute grew so heated that it threatened to create a genuine conflict between the upper and lower worlds, between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living, between two goddesses whose power, if turned against each other, could cause consequences that would affect all of creation. Word of the argument reached Zeus, king of the gods, who decided he had to intervene before his niece and his wife's daughter destroyed the cosmic order over a mortal boy, no matter how beautiful that boy might be. Zeus summoned both goddesses to appear before him, along with Adonis, to settle this matter once and for all. Some versions of the myth say that Zeus, not wanting to offend either goddess directly by ruling in favor of one over the other, delegated the decision to Calliope, one of the 9 muses, patron of epic poetry and eloquence. She was known for her wisdom and fair judgment, and Zeus hoped she could devise a solution that would satisfy everyone. After considering the matter carefully, Calliope delivered her judgment. Adonis would not belong entirely to either goddess. Instead, he would divide his time between them. 1/3 of the year he would spend with Aphrodite in the upper world. Another third he would spend with Persephone in the underworld. and the final third of the year would be his own, to spend as he wished, with whomever he chose. Zeus confirmed this decision as law, binding both goddesses to honor it. Neither was entirely satisfied. Aphrodite, because she had to share Adonis at all. Persephone, because she had hoped to keep him forever. But neither could object without defying Zeus himself. The arrangement was set, and Adonis's fate was decided by divine decree rather than his own choice. But there was a quirk in the arrangement that Calliope had perhaps deliberately included, or perhaps Zeus had added himself, sensing how the situation would resolve. The final third of the year, the time that Adonis could spend however he wished, was truly his to decide. He could choose to split it between the goddesses, giving each equal time. He could choose to spend it in solitude if he wished. Or he could give all of those 4 months to whichever goddess he preferred. Adonis, standing before Zeus and the assembled gods, his beauty so striking that even the Olympians found themselves staring, made his choice. He would spend his own months with Aphrodite. Every year, he would give her 2/3 of his time, 8 months with the goddess of love, and only 4 months with Persephone in the underworld. Persephone was furious. Aphrodite was triumphant. And Adonis, perhaps relieved that the decision was made, that he wouldn't be pulled apart by these 2 powerful beings fighting over him, prepared to ascend to the upper world with Aphrodite and see the sun for the first time in years. As Aphrodite led him up through the dark paths toward the surface, toward the light and air and life that had been denied him during his years below. She felt something she had never quite felt before. Yes, she was pleased to have won the contest with Persephone. Yes, she was proud to have secured the most beautiful mortal in creation as her companion. But there was something else, something deeper and more vulnerable. She looked at Adonis walking beside her, his face turning upward toward the light that was growing brighter as they ascended, and she felt genuine affection, not just desire, not just possessiveness, but actual care for this young man who had been a pawn in divine games from the moment of his birth. She didn't know it yet, but Aphrodite was falling in love. Truly, deeply, helplessly in love, the way she had caused countless others to fall, but had never quite experienced herself. And that love, beautiful as it would be, would lead to a grief more profound than any mortal could imagine. When the goddess of love fell in love, when Adonis and Aphrodite finally emerged into the world above, Adonis saw the sun for the first time since infancy. The light must have been overwhelming after his years in the dim underworld, the warmth strange and wonderful on his skin. The sky stretched above him, impossibly vast and blue. The land spread before him in every direction, filled with colors and life and movement that the static realm of the dead had never offered. Birds sang. Wind moved through trees. Flowers bloomed along the path. It was intoxicating. And Aphrodite watched him, taking it all in, with an expression of such wonder and joy that she fell even more deeply under his spell. She had created love in others countless times, had watched mortals and gods alike succumb to the passion she stirred in them, but she had always remained somewhat apart from it, observing rather than experiencing. Now she understood what it felt like to want someone so much that their happiness became more important than your own. She wanted to show Adonis everything beautiful in the world, wanted to see his face light up with discovery, wanted to be the source of his joy. She took him to her most sacred places first. They went to Cyprus, her island, where temples stood in her honor and roses bloomed in profusion. She showed him the spot where she had first emerged from the sea foam, where the water still seemed to sparkle more brightly than anywhere else. They visited gardens she had cultivated, springs she had blessed, groves where her followers left offerings. And everywhere they went, Aphrodite introduced him not as her lover, not yet, but as someone under her protection, someone special. For his part, Adonis was dazzled by everything. The world above was a revelation, but he was also drawn to something Aphrodite had not expected. He discovered hunting, and he loved it with a passion that surprised them both. Perhaps it was the long years of confinement in the underworld that made the freedom of running through forests appealing. Perhaps it was a way to test his strength and skill. Perhaps there was something in his blood, inherited from his mother, who had run like a deer when fleeing her father's wrath, that made him feel most alive when pursuing prey through the wilderness. He asked Aphrodite to take him hunting, and she agreed, though it was not an activity she had ever particularly enjoyed. But for Adonis, she would do anything. So she transformed herself from the goddess of soft pleasures into something resembling Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt. Aphrodite hiked up her robes to her knees so they wouldn't catch on thorns or drag through streams. She traded her delicate sandals for sturdier boots. She let her perfectly arranged hair come loose and wild. She followed Adonis through the forests as he tracked deer and rabbits and other gentle prey. And she cheered his successes and laughed at his failures. And she found that she was happy in a way she had never quite been before. The other gods noticed her transformation with a mixture of amusement and concern. Aphrodite, who had always been so fastidious about her appearance, who spent hours arranging her hair and selecting the perfect jewelry, who never allowed herself to be seen unless she looked absolutely flawless, was now scrambling through underbrush and wading through streams with her dress muddy and her face flushed from exertion. She was neglecting her duties, missing meetings on Olympus, letting prayers go unanswered because she was too busy following a mortal through the woods. Her husband Hephaestus barely noticed her absence, being long accustomed to her affairs and finding relief in not having to pretend their marriage was anything other than what it was: a political arrangement that satisfied neither of them. But Ares, the god of war and Aphrodite's longtime lover, noticed very much indeed. He watched from Olympus as Aphrodite devoted herself to this beautiful mortal boy, giving him the kind of attention and genuine affection that she had never given to Ares himself. Jealousy began to burn in the war god's heart, a slow building rage that would eventually have terrible consequences. But for now, in those early days, Adonis and Aphrodite were simply happy. They spent their 8 months together each year in each other's constant company. They hunted during the day, though Aphrodite always insisted they avoid the dangerous animals: the wild boars with their wicked tusks, the bears with their massive claws, the lions with their crushing jaws. "Hunt the deer and the rabbits," she would tell him, running her fingers through his hair as they rested in the shade after a successful morning. "Hunt the gentle things that flee rather than fight. But never, my love, never pursue the creatures that nature has armed for war." "Why?" Adonis would ask, teasing her gently. "Are you afraid I can't handle them? I'm not as fragile as I look." "I know you're strong," Aphrodite would reply, her voice serious despite his playful tone. "I know you're skilled, but even the mightiest heroes can fall to a wild boar's tusk or a lion's claw. Beauty and youth mean nothing to beasts that fight only for survival. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you." He would laugh and kiss her forehead and promise to be careful. But she could see the restless energy in him, the desire to test himself against something more challenging than timid prey. Young men always think they're invincible, always believe death is something that happens to others, but never to them. Aphrodite had seen too many beautiful youths die young to share that confidence. At night, they would lie together under the stars, and Aphrodite would tell him stories of the gods and their intrigues, of ancient times before mortals existed, of her own birth from sea foam, and the strange destiny that had made her the goddess of love, when she herself had never truly understood what love meant until she met him. Adonis would listen and ask questions, and sometimes he would tell her what little he remembered of the underworld, of Persephone's kindness, and the strange beauty of that realm without sunlight. "Do you miss it?" Aphrodite once asked. "The underworld? Persephone?" "Sometimes," Adonis admitted. "She was good to me. She raised me when I was alone. I feel guilty choosing you over her." "She'll have you for 4 months, every year," Aphrodite pointed out, trying not to sound bitter about even that compromise. "That's more time than many mortals spend with their mothers once they're grown." "I know, but still, I feel I've hurt her. And I don't like hurting anyone, not even to be with you. It was that gentleness, that kindness, that made Aphrodite love him even more. He wasn't just beautiful. He was good. He had somehow emerged from his dark origins and traumatic birth with a kind heart intact. In a world where beauty often came with cruelty, where the powerful often grew arrogant, where even bees could be petty and vindictive, Adonis was genuinely good. It made him even more precious in her eyes, and even more vulnerable to a world that was not always kind to the good. The 8 months they spent together each year were idyllic. When Adonis was with Aphrodite, the world seemed to respond. Spring came early and lingered late. Flowers bloomed in profusion. Fruit ripened on the trees. The weather was mild and gentle. Farmers had good harvests. Lovers fell in love more easily and stayed in love longer. The world itself seemed to sense that the goddess of love was happy, and it reflected her joy back to everyone else. But when the time came for Adonis to descend to the underworld for his 4 months with Persephone, everything changed. Aphrodite would become melancholy, almost listless. She would go through the motions of her divine duties, but without enthusiasm. The weather would turn cold. Plants would wither. Crops would fail. Winter would settle. Over the land, like a gray blanket, reflecting Aphrodite's grief at being separated from the one she loved. Some scholars have noted the parallel between this story and the more famous myth of Persephone's own annual descent into the underworld. Just as Demeter, goddess of the harvest, mourned her daughter's absence and let the world grow barren during winter, so too did Aphrodite mourn Adonis, and her sorrow affected the world in similar ways. It was as if there were 2 winters in ancient Greece, one caused by a mother's grief for her daughter, and one caused by a lover's grief for her beloved. The seasons themselves became a reflection of divine emotion. The earth's cycles tied to the heartbreak of goddesses. During those 4 months of separation, Aphrodite would often stand at the entrance to the underworld, as close as she could get to where Adonis had descended, and simply wait. Sometimes she would call down to him, her voice echoing through the dark passages, though she could never hear if he responded. Sometimes she would leave offerings at the mouth of the cave, flowers that would wilt in the darkness, sweet wine poured onto the stones, messages scratched into clay tablets that she would push as far into the shadows as she dared to go. Persephone, down in her realm of the dead, would receive Adonis with a mixture of genuine affection and bitter satisfaction. She still cared for him, still saw him as the child she had raised, but she also knew that he came to her reluctantly, that he counted the days until he could return to Aphrodite. She tried to make his time below pleasant. She showed him new regions of the underworld that she hadn't revealed when he was younger. She introduced him to the interesting souls that came through, heroes and villains, the brilliant and the mad, all the variety of humanity in death. She tried to remind him that there was beauty even in the realm of shadows, that endings had their own poetry. But Adonis would always leave when his time was up, would always climb those stairs back to the light and to Aphrodite waiting for him at the top. And Persephone would watch him go with a mixture of resignation and resentment, knowing that no matter what she did, she could never compete with the goddess of love for his affections. She had lost him years ago when he made his choice, and she lost him again every time he left. This cycle continued year after year. Adonis would spend 8 months with Aphrodite, learning to love the world above, growing more skilled as a hunter, becoming even more beautiful as he fully matured into manhood. And then he would spend 4 months with Persephone, a dutiful but distant ward, fulfilling his obligation, but never giving her his heart. And each time the cycle began again, Aphrodite's joy at his return would be tinged with the knowledge that in just 8 months she would have to let him go again. "Why don't you just stay?" she asked him once, during one of their last nights together before he had to descend. "The agreement was made when you were young and had no choice in the matter. You're a man now. You can make your own decisions. Just refuse to go. Zeus wouldn't punish you for choosing to stay with me." Adonis was quiet for a long moment. "I made a promise," he finally said. "When Zeus made his judgment and gave me the choice of where to spend my own months, I chose you. But I accepted that the other 4 months belonged to Persephone. If I break that agreement now, what does that make me? A man who keeps his word only when it's convenient? It makes you a man who chooses his own happiness, Aphrodite said, but without much conviction. She knew he was right. She knew that part of what made her love him was his integrity, his refusal to be cruel, even when cruelty would be easier. If he broke his word to Persephone, if he simply abandoned her, he would no longer be the Adonis she loved. He would be someone lesser, someone harder. And she couldn't ask him to become less than he was, not even for her sake. So the cycle continued, year after year, with Aphrodite treasuring every moment they had together and dreading the inevitable separation that would come. She tried to memorize everything about him, the exact shade of his eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the sound of his laugh, the warmth of his hand in hers. She tried to hold on to him, even as time carried them both forward toward a future she couldn't quite see, though she felt a shadow hanging over it that she couldn't name. The prophecy of blood and petals. The shadow that Aphrodite sensed hanging over their future had a name, and that name was Ares. The god of war had watched Aphrodite's devotion to Adonis with growing fury. He had been her lover for years before Adonis appeared, had shared her bed when her husband Hephaestus was too absorbed in his forge to notice or care. But their relationship had been one of passion without depth, physical attraction without emotional connection. Ares had never stirred Aphrodite's heart the way Adonis did, had never made her laugh the way Adonis did, had never been willing to transform himself for her the way Adonis had. And Ares, god of violence and bloodshed, was not accustomed to being replaced. His jealousy grew like a tumor, fed by every day that Aphrodite spent with Adonis instead of him. He began to plan his revenge, though he had to be careful. Killing a mortal was easy enough for a god, but doing it in a way that couldn't be traced back to him, that wouldn't expose him to punishment from Zeus or vengeance from Aphrodite, required subtlety that did not come naturally to the straightforward god of war. Some versions of the myth say that Ares transformed himself into a wild boar, massive and fierce, with tusks like curved swords, and eyes that burned with immortal rage barely contained in an animal form. Other versions say that he simply appeared to a particularly large and aggressive boar that lived in the forests near Mount Lebanon, where Adonis often hunted, and whispered suggestions into its mind, guiding it toward a particular valley where he knew Adonis would be on a particular day. Still, other versions complicate the story further by bringing in other gods who had reasons to want Adonis dead. Some say it was Artemis, virgin goddess of the hunt, who sent the boar. Her motive? either anger at Aphrodite for some offense, or grief for her own lost love. A handsome youth named Hippolytus, who had rejected all romantic love in favor of devoting himself to hunting and Artemis's service. When Hippolytus died, some say Artemis grew bitter about seeing Aphrodite happy with a beautiful youth when her own beloved follower was gone. But this seems out of character for Artemis, who was generally fair and just even in her anger. Another version claims it was Apollo who sent the boar, in revenge for Aphrodite having blinded his son Erymanthus when the young man accidentally saw the goddess bathing. Apollo, the story goes, never forgot the offense and waited for an opportunity to strike back at Aphrodite through the thing she loved most. But again, this seems to contradict what we know of Apollo's character. He was proud and could be vengeful, but he was also rational and usually directed his anger at those who actually offended him rather than innocent third parties. The most psychologically satisfying version, the one that makes the most sense given what we know of the gods' personalities, is that Ares was responsible, either directly or indirectly. His jealousy had motive, his nature had the brutality, and his relationship with Aphrodite gave him the knowledge of where she and Adonis would be, and when they would be vulnerable. The day it happened started like any other. Adonis woke early, as he always did on hunting days, excited to be out in the forest before the sun burned off the morning mist. Aphrodite woke with him, as she always did, and immediately felt a sense of dread that she couldn't explain. It sat in her stomach like a stone, heavy and cold. "Don't go hunting today," she said, clutching his arm as he prepared his gear. "Please, stay with me. We can do something else." "What's wrong?" Adonis asked, concerned by the fear in her voice. "Are you ill? You never get sick." "I don't know what's wrong," Aphrodite admitted. "I just have a terrible feeling, like something bad is going to happen if you go out there today." Adonis smiled and kissed her forehead. "You worry too much. I'll be fine. I'm always fine. I'll stay away from the dangerous animals, just like you've always told me to. I promise." "Then let me come with you," Aphrodite said, still holding his arm. "Don't go alone. At least, let me be there." "I won't be alone. I'm meeting some other hunters in the valley. We're going to work together to drive a deer herd toward the river where we can corner them. It's a group hunt, very safe, very organized. I'll be back before sunset, and we'll have venison for dinner." He pulled gently away from her grasp, gathered his spear and his hunting knife, and headed out into the gray pre-dawn light. Aphrodite stood in the doorway and watched him go. that feeling of dread growing stronger with every step he took away from her. She almost called him back, almost used her divine authority to command him to stay. But she stopped herself. He was a mortal man, not a child or a pet. She couldn't control his every move just because she was afraid. Fear was no way to love someone. So she let him go, and that decision would haunt her for eternity. Adonis met his fellow hunters as planned. They were all mortal men from the nearby villages, experienced huntsmen who knew the forest well. They spread out to form a line and began moving through the trees, making noise to startle the deer and drive them toward the river valley where other hunters waited to make the kill. But something went wrong. As they moved through a particularly dense thicket, one of the hunters saw movement in the bushes ahead. Thinking it was a deer, he signaled to the others, and they tightened their formation, ready to flush the animal out into the open. But what emerged from the thicket was not a deer. It was an enormous, wild boar, larger than any of them had ever seen. Its shoulders were as high as a man's chest. Its tusks curved up from its jaw like twin scimitars, yellowed with age and stained with the blood of previous victims. Its eyes were small and red and filled with a rage that seemed almost intelligent, almost purposeful. Steam rose from its bristled back in the cool morning air, making it look like some demon from the underworld rather than a natural animal. The hunters froze. In encounters with wild boars, the wisest course is often to back away slowly, to give the animal room to escape. Boars will usually flee if given the chance. They only charge when cornered or when they perceive a threat to their young. But this boar didn't flee. It lowered its massive head, pawed the ground once with a hoof that could crush bones, and then charged directly at the line of hunters. The men scattered, scrambling to get out of the way. Some dove behind trees. Others turned and ran outright, abandoning any pretense of courage in favor of survival. The boar selected its target with terrible precision, ignoring all the other hunters and focusing entirely on Adonis. Perhaps it was because he was the most beautiful, and beauty attracts attention even from beasts. Perhaps it was because he stood his ground when the others fled, gripping his spear and preparing to defend himself rather than running. Or perhaps it was because something more than animal instinct was guiding the boar's actions, something that wanted specifically to destroy the thing that Aphrodite loved most. Adonis planted his feet and held his spear ready, its point aimed at the boar's chest. If he could time it right, if he could hold steady as the animal charged and let it impale itself on the spear while he dodged to the side at the last moment. He might survive. It was a technique he had practiced, though never against anything as large and fierce as this monster. The boar charged. Adonis thrust his spear forward. The point struck the boar's shoulder and penetrated, but not deeply enough. The animal's thick hide and dense muscle stopped the spear point before it could reach anything vital. The force of the impact tore the spear from Adonis's hands and sent him stumbling backward. Before he could recover his balance, before he could draw his knife or even try to run, the boar was on him. It lowered its head and drove one of those massive tusks into Adonis's thigh with the force of a battering ram. The tusk punched through skin and muscle and struck bone, then withdrew as the boar's momentum carried it past. Adonis fell, blood pouring from the wound, already knowing in that instant that it was a mortal injury. The boar could have finished him then. It could have turned and gored him again, could have crushed him under its hooves, could have torn him apart with its tusks. But it didn't. Having delivered its fatal blow, having accomplished what it came for, the boar simply vanished back into the forest, crashing through the underbrush and disappearing as if it had never been there at all. The other hunters came running when they heard Adonis's scream. They found him lying in a spreading pool of his own blood, his face white with shock, his hands pressed uselessly against the wound in his thigh where the boar's tusk had severed the great artery. Blood pulsed out between his fingers with each beat of his heart, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. "Get Aphrodite," Adonis gasped. "Please, I need to see her. Before—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all knew he was dying. One of the hunters ran as fast as his legs could carry him, back toward the place where Aphrodite was staying. But even mortal messengers traveling at their fastest are slower than divine intuition. Aphrodite knew the moment Adonis was wounded. She felt it like a blow to her own heart, a sudden terrible certainty that the thing she feared had come to pass. She didn't wait for confirmation. She didn't stop to gather anything or tell anyone where she was going. She simply ran. The goddess of love, who had always been so careful of her appearance, who had never allowed herself to be seen as anything less than perfectly beautiful, ran through the forest like a wild thing. Her carefully arranged hair came loose and streamed behind her. Her fine dress caught on thorns and tore. Branches scratched her face and arms, drawing blood from divine skin that had never been marked before. She didn't care. She barely noticed. All she cared about was reaching Adonis in time. But the forest seemed to conspire against her. Paths that should have been clear were blocked. Roots reached up to catch her feet. Thorns tore at her like grasping hands. Later, people would say that the white roses that grew along her path turned red that day, stained by the blood from the goddess's torn feet as she ran to reach her dying love. The thorns that scratched her did so with a cruel irony. She who had always represented pleasure and beauty was now intimately acquainted with pain. By the time she reached the place where Adonis lay, he was barely conscious. So much blood had poured from the wound that the ground was black with it. His beautiful face was gray, his lips bloodless, his eyes unfocused. The other hunters had tried to bind the wound, had tried to slow the bleeding, but mortal remedies meant nothing against an injury that had been designed by divine malice to kill. Aphrodite fell to her knees beside him and gathered him into her arms, heedless of the blood that soaked into her dress, that covered her hands and arms. "No," she said, and her voice broke on the word. "No, no, no. This can't be happening. You can't leave me. I won't allow it." Adonis's eyes focused on her face with effort. He tried to smile. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You told me to be careful. You warned me." "Don't talk," Aphrodite said, tears streaming down her face. "Save your strength. I'll get help. I'll take you to Olympus. We have healing there that can fix this. We have ambrosia and nectar that can cure any wound. Just hold on." But Adonis was shaking his head slightly, using what little strength he had left. "Too late," he breathed. "I can feel it. It's too late." He was right. Even as Aphrodite held him, even as she tried to will her divine power into his body, to force his heart to keep beating, and his blood to stay where it belonged, she could feel him slipping away. Death was already reaching for him with cold fingers, and not even the goddess of love could hold him back from that final journey. "I love you," Adonis said, and his voice was so faint she had to lean close to hear it. "I love you more than anything, more than light, more than life. I wish we had more time." "We will," Aphrodite sobbed. "We will have more time. I'll find a way. I'll make a deal with Hades and Persephone. I'll trade something, anything. Just don't go. Please don't go." But Adonis's eyes were already going glassy. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, then stopped altogether. His body went slack in Aphrodite's arms, becoming suddenly heavy in the way that only death makes a body heavy, as if the soul that animated it had been providing some essential lightness that was now gone forever. Aphrodite let out a wail of grief that echoed through the forest, that was heard on distant Olympus, that made the other gods stop whatever they were doing and turn their heads in the direction of that terrible sound. It was the cry of a goddess who had finally understood what love truly meant, what it cost, what it demanded, and who had learned that lesson in the cruelest possible way, through loss. She held his body and wept, and her tears fell onto his blood-soaked clothes and onto the ground beneath him. And where her tears mixed with his blood, something impossible began to happen. The earth itself responded to the grief of a goddess, to the mingling of divine sorrow and mortal death. From grief blooms beauty, the flowers of love and loss. The ancient Greeks believed that strong emotions could alter reality itself, that grief intense enough or love powerful enough could leave permanent marks on the world. When Aphrodite wept over Adonis's body, when her divine tears mixed with his mortal blood, the earth remembered. The ground absorbed that mixture of sorrow and sacrifice, of love and loss, and from it grew flowers that had never existed before. From the blood that had poured from Adonis's wound, where it soaked deepest into the soil, rose the first anemone. The flower sprang up almost immediately, growing with supernatural speed, unfurling delicate petals that ranged from deep purple to vivid red to pure white. The ancient name for this flower, wind flower, came from the Greek words anemos, meaning wind. And one story says that the name reflects how briefly these flowers bloom. They appear in spring and fade quickly, their petals scattered by the slightest breeze, just as Adonis's life was scattered by a moment of violence. But there's a deeper meaning to the windflower's name. In Greek thought, wind represented things that were beautiful but impermanent, powerful but impossible to hold. You could feel the wind, could see its effects, could be moved by it, but you could never grasp it, never keep it, never force it to stay when it wanted to move on. The anemone, born from Adonis's blood, embodied the same qualities. It was beautiful beyond measure, vivid and delicate at once, but it lasted only briefly before the petals fell and were carried away by the wind that gave the flower its name. Some versions of the myth add another detail. They say that when Aphrodite saw the anemones growing from Adonis's blood, she decreed that these flowers would bloom each spring, and die each fall, creating an annual cycle of growth and death that mirrored Adonis's own division of the year between the world above and the underworld below. The anemone became a living calendar, marking his absence and return, a natural memorial to a love that transcended death, even though it couldn't prevent it. But the anemones weren't the only flowers born from this tragedy. The roses that grew wild in that part of the forest, the ones that had torn Aphrodite's feet as she ran to reach Adonis, were originally white. They had been pure and unmarked, symbols of innocence and divine perfection. But when Aphrodite's blood fell on them as she rushed through the thorns, their petals absorbed it and were permanently stained. From that day forward, red roses grew where white ones had been, and they became the flower most associated with passionate love, with the kind of devotion that was willing to bleed for the beloved. This is why roses have thorns, some storytellers added. The thorns represent the pain that inevitably accompanies deep love, the wounds that come from caring so much about another person that their suffering becomes your own. Beautiful things often hurt us, the myth seemed to say. Love and pain are braided together like the stems of climbing roses, impossible to separate, each making the other more meaningful. Aphrodite stayed with Adonis's body until the other gods came to collect her. They found her cradled over him, her hair matted with blood and tears, her dress ruined, her face swollen from weeping. She looked nothing like the goddess of beauty and love. She looked like any mortal woman who had lost the person she loved most in the world, broken, devastated, transformed by grief into something raw and real and terrible to witness. Zeus himself came, along with Hermes, whose duties included escorting the dead to the underworld. They spoke to her gently, trying to coax her to let go of the body, to allow Adonis to begin his final journey. But Aphrodite refused. "He's mine," she said, her voice hoarse from screaming and crying. "He chose me. 8 months of every year he was mine, and I won't give him up. Not to death, not to Persephone, not to anyone." "He's dead, Aphrodite," Zeus said, not unkindly. "His time in the world above is over. He must go to the underworld now, permanently. That is the law of mortality. Even you cannot change it." "Then I'll go with him," Aphrodite said wildly. "I'll descend to the underworld and stay there. If he can't be in the light anymore, then I'll live in darkness. Where he is, I am. That's how love works." "That's not how anything works," Hermes said, more practically. You're a goddess. You have responsibilities. The world needs you. Mortals need you. You can't simply abandon your duties because one mortal died. I don't care about my duties, Aphrodite shouted. I don't care about the world or the mortals or anything else. He's dead. Don't you understand? Adonis is dead, and it's my fault. How is it your fault? Zeus asked. I should have stopped him from going hunting, Aphrodite sobbed. I felt something was wrong. I knew something bad was going to happen, and I let him go anyway, because I didn't want to control him, because I wanted to respect his freedom, because I tried to love him the right way instead of just keeping him safe. And now he's dead, and I'll never see him again, never hear his voice, or feel his hand in mine, or watch the way his face lit up when he saw something beautiful. He's gone, and I'm still here, and I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to keep existing in a world that doesn't have him in it. The other gods were silent for a moment. Even Zeus, who had loved and lost many mortals over the centuries, who had watched children and lovers age and die while he remained eternally young, seemed moved by the depth of Aphrodite's grief. It was one thing to have casual affairs with mortals, to enjoy them briefly, and then move on when they inevitably died. It was something else entirely to truly love them, to invest your whole heart in something you knew would end, to care so deeply that their death felt like your own. Let me make a bargain, Aphrodite said, suddenly, looking up at Zeus with desperate hope lighting her tear-stained face. I've heard of mortals being brought back from death before. Orpheus tried to do it for Eurydice. Asclepius actually succeeded in raising the dead before you struck him down for it. Why can't Adonis come back? What would it cost? What would I have to give up? I'll pay any price. I'll give up anything. Just bring him back. Zeus shook his head slowly. The cases you mentioned are different. Orpheus failed because he couldn't follow simple instructions. Asclepius succeeded, but he was disrupting the natural order so badly that I had to stop him. If I made an exception for Adonis, every god who ever loved a mortal would demand the same treatment. Death would lose its meaning. The boundary between mortal and immortal would dissolve. The cosmos would fall into chaos. I don't care about the cosmos, Aphrodite said flatly. I care about him. I know, Zeus said, and there was genuine sympathy in his voice. But the answer is still no. However, he paused, considering. When he spoke again, his words were careful, chosen with the precision of someone who wanted to help but had to work within certain constraints. The agreement that was made when Adonis was alive, the division of his time between you and Persephone, was binding only during his life. Now that he's dead, he belongs entirely to the underworld. Persephone has exclusive claim to him now. But perhaps, if you asked her very nicely, if you reminded her that she once cared for him as a child, if you appealed to whatever kindness she might still feel, perhaps she might agree to let you visit him sometimes, or to let him visit the surface for brief periods. Not alive, not as he was, but as a shade, a spirit. You wouldn't have him back the way you want, but you would have something. It's the best I can offer. Aphrodite looked down at Adonis's body, at his beautiful face now cold and empty. The idea of him as a mere shade, a ghost without substance or warmth, was almost worse than never seeing him at all. But it was better than nothing. Barely. But it was. "I'll speak to Persephone," she whispered. "Good," Zeus said. "But first, you have to let him go. You have to let Hermes do his job. The longer a soul stays unguided after death, the more confused it becomes, the harder it is for it to find its way to the afterlife. If you truly love Adonis, you'll let him go now, while his spirit can still travel easily to where it needs to be." It was the hardest thing Aphrodite had ever done, but she released her grip on Adonis's body. She laid him gently on the blood-soaked ground and stood up, her legs barely holding her. Hermes approached the body and began the rituals that would separate the spirit from the flesh and guide it down to the underworld. Aphrodite watched, memorizing every detail, as if by watching intently enough she could somehow follow where she couldn't physically go. When Hermes and the spirit of Adonis vanished, when she was left standing alone in a forest clearing, with nothing but a body that was no longer the person she loved, Aphrodite finally allowed herself to be led away. Zeus took her back to Olympus, where she shut herself in her chambers and refused to see anyone for days. The world suffered during her withdrawal. No new loves kindled. Married couples found themselves bickering over nothing. Artists lost their inspiration. Beauty itself seemed to dim slightly, as if the source that fed it had been turned off at the tap. Eventually, Aphrodite emerged. She bathed and dressed and arranged her hair, restoring her appearance to something resembling her usual perfection. But those who knew her well could see that something fundamental had changed. There was a sadness in her eyes that had never been there before, a knowledge of loss that couldn't be erased. She had always been beautiful, but now her beauty had a melancholy edge to it, the kind of loveliness that makes you want to cry even as you admire it. And she kept her word. She descended to the underworld and sought an audience with Persephone. The meeting must have been difficult for both of them. Persephone had never forgiven Aphrodite for taking Adonis from her. And now Aphrodite had to humble herself before her rival and beg for what amounted to scraps, permission to see the spirit of the man they had both loved. The exact terms of their arrangement have been lost to time, obscured by different retellings and conflicting accounts. But most versions agree that Persephone, perhaps moved by her own memories of loving Adonis, perhaps satisfied by seeing Aphrodite brought low by the same kind of loss that she herself experienced every time Adonis had left the underworld, agreed to a compromise. Adonis's spirit would be allowed to visit the upper world during certain times of the year, returning to Aphrodite not as a living man, but as a shade, present but not quite there, visible but untouchable. Some said this happened during the spring, when the anemones bloomed and the world came back to life after winter's death. Others said it was during the summer, when roses were at their most fragrant and beautiful. Whenever it happened, those were the times when Aphrodite seemed most at peace, when the sadness in her eyes lifted slightly, when she could pretend, just for a little while, that she had him back. The flowers that grew from their tragedy became sacred to Aphrodite. The red rose became her primary symbol, worn by her followers, used in her temples, planted in her sacred groves. When Greeks wanted to honor love, or celebrate a wedding, or pray for romantic success, they brought roses to Aphrodite's altars, and the goddess would smell them and remember the day she bled for the man she loved. The anemone became a symbol of something more complex, of beauty that fades quickly, of love that ends too soon, of the bitter-sweet nature of caring for mortal things when you yourself are immortal. Poets would write about anemones growing in places where tears had fallen, where grief had touched the earth. Artists would paint them with an edge of melancholy, using them to represent fleeting joy or beautiful sadness, or the complex tangle of emotions that comes from loving something you know you're going to lose. In later centuries, when the language of flowers became a sophisticated form of communication, red roses meant passionate, romantic love, while anemones meant forsaken love, a relationship ended by death or circumstance, grief for what was lost. Both flowers, in their way, told Aphrodite's story. Both kept Adonis's memory alive long after the people who first told his story had themselves passed into death. The Adonia. When women mourned together. The myth of Adonis and Aphrodite didn't remain just a story. It became the foundation for one of the most fascinating religious festivals in ancient Greece, the Adonia. This festival, celebrated primarily by women, took place during the height of summer, typically in late July or early August. It was a ritual of mourning and memory, a communal expression of the same grief that Aphrodite had felt, a way for mortal women to honor both the beautiful youth who died too young and the goddess who loved him. The Adonia was unusual among Greek festivals in several ways. First, it was not sponsored or organized by the state. Unlike major festivals like the Panathenaia or the Dionysia, it was a private affair, arranged and conducted by women in their own homes or in informal gatherings. Second, it focused on themes that most Greek religious practice preferred to avoid: death, grief, the pain of loss, the futility of trying to hold on to things that are slipping away. Most Greek festivals celebrated triumph, fertility, abundance, continuity. The Adonia celebrated endings. The central ritual of the Adonia involved creating what were called gardens of Adonis. Women would take shallow baskets or broken pottery and fill them with soil. In this soil, they would plant fast-growing seeds: wheat, barley, fennel, lettuce, sometimes flowers. These makeshift gardens would be placed on rooftops where the hot summer sun beat down on them mercilessly. The seeds would sprout quickly, shooting up in just a few days, reaching toward the light with desperate speed. But these gardens were never meant to last. The soil in the shallow containers was insufficient. The sun was too intense. The roots had nowhere to go. Within a week, sometimes less, the plants would wither and die, their brief lives ending almost as soon as they began. The women would watch this happen, would tend to the dying plants as if trying to forestall the inevitable, and then would gather the dead vegetation and carry it in procession through the streets, wailing and mourning as if for a beloved person. The symbolism was painfully obvious. The gardens of Adonis represented Adonis himself, beautiful, promising, sprouting toward maturity, but never reaching it. Alive so briefly that his life seemed more like a gesture toward living than the real thing. The shallow soil represented the mortal world, which could support life, but never permanently, which gave and then took away. The withering plants under the merciless sun represented the inevitability of death, the way time and circumstance will eventually kill even the strongest and most beautiful things. But there was more to it than just agricultural metaphor. The gardens of Adonis also represented something deeper about women's experiences in ancient Greek society. These were cultures where women had little control over their own lives, where they were married off to men they might not love, where they were expected to produce children who might die in infancy, where their bodies and their fates were determined by fathers, husbands, brothers. The Adonia gave them a space to acknowledge grief, not just for mythical Adonis, but for all the losses in their own lives, all the endings they had endured, all the beautiful things that had been taken from them too soon. During the festival, women would gather on rooftops and in courtyards. They would sing dirges, mournful songs that lamented Adonis's death. They would beat their breasts in the traditional gesture of grief and tear their clothes. They would let their hair down, abandoning the careful arrangements that respectable women were expected to maintain. They would, in other words, perform grief publicly and loudly in ways that were normally forbidden to them. Greek society expected women to be controlled, quiet, modest. The Adonia gave them permission, just for one festival, to be wild with sorrow. Some ancient sources suggest that the festival also included elements of sexual freedom that were unusual for Greek women. There are hints that during the Adonia, normal social restrictions loosened, that women might take lovers or engage in behaviors that would be scandalous at other times. This connects back to Aphrodite herself, goddess not just of tender love, but of sexual passion, of desire in all its forms. The festival honored her by acknowledging that part of life, too. The physical yearning that Aphrodite had felt for Adonis, the bodily dimension of love that polite society often preferred to ignore. The playwright Aristophanes referenced the Adonia in his comedy Lysistrata, written in 411 BCE. In the play, the women of Athens and Sparta go on a sex strike to force their husbands to end the Peloponnesian War. At one point, the male characters complain about the women gathering on rooftops to celebrate the Adonia, wailing loudly about Adonis's death, while the men are trying to make important political decisions. The men find the women's public mourning annoying and disruptive, which tells us something interesting. The Adonia was loud enough and visible enough to be a genuine social presence, and the men in power found it bothersome. Why would men find women's mourning rituals annoying? Perhaps because the Adonia, in its way, was subversive. It created a space where women could express feelings that challenged the social order. It acknowledged that beautiful things die young, that the most promising lives are often cut short, that there's a fundamental tragedy at the heart of existence that no amount of military victory or political success can eliminate. This was not a message that the men running Athens particularly wanted to hear while they were busy trying to win wars and govern cities, and pretend that they had control over things they manifestly did not control. The festival also included feasting, which might seem contradictory for a mourning ritual. But the ancient Greeks understood that grief and celebration weren't opposites. They often went together. You mourned because you had loved. You celebrated the person who was gone by remembering the joy they had brought. The food at the Adonia was often sweet. Cakes made with honey, fruits, wine mixed with spices. It was food meant for pleasure, for momentary happiness, just as Adonis's life had been momentary, but filled with the pleasure of Aphrodite's love. Some versions of the festival included a ritual where women would make small images of Adonis and Aphrodite, figurines crafted from clay or wood. They would place these images together, symbolizing the lovers' union, and then separate them, reenacting their division. The Adonis figure would be ritually killed and then mourned over, sometimes even buried or thrown into water as if being sent to the underworld. Then, in a reversal that represented the spirit's periodic return to the upper world, the figure would be recovered and reunited with the Aphrodite image, bringing the cycle full circle. The Adonia spread beyond Greece to other parts of the Mediterranean world. When Greek culture expanded through Alexander the Great's conquests, the festival went with it. Romans adopted it, though they sometimes called Adonis by different names or merged his worship with that of other dying and reviving gods from Near Eastern traditions. In places like Egypt and Syria, where similar myths about gods who died and returned already existed, the Adonia blended with local traditions, creating hybrid festivals that honored both the Greek myth and the native stories. The Christian Church eventually suppressed the Adonia, as it did with most pagan festivals. The Church Fathers found the festival particularly objectionable because of its associations with female sexuality and its focus on a love affair between a goddess and a mortal man. The public mourning, the loosened social controls, the celebration of physical beauty and desire, all of these elements made the Adonia incompatible with Christian values as the Church understood them. But echoes of the festival persisted in folk traditions long after official paganism ended. In some Mediterranean regions, women continued to plant small gardens in midsummer and let them die, though they might claim they were doing it for different reasons, without reference to Adonis or Aphrodite. The practice of mourning beautiful young men who died tragically found new expressions in Christian contexts. Lamentations for martyrs, grief for saints who suffered young deaths. The form changed, but the underlying human need to ritualize loss remained. Modern scholars have debated what the Adonia meant to the women who celebrated it. Some see it as proto-feminist, a rare space where ancient women could exercise agency and express emotions that society otherwise demanded they suppress. Others view it more cautiously, noting that even this festival ultimately reinforced certain gender roles by casting women primarily as mourners and nurturers rather than actors. Some scholars emphasize the agricultural symbolism, seeing the gardens of Adonis as a way of understanding seasonal cycles and crop failures. Others focus on the psychological dimension, viewing the festival as a healthy outlet for grief in a society where child mortality was high, and most people could expect to lose someone they loved to early death. All these interpretations probably contain some truth. The Adonia was complex, layered with multiple meanings that different participants understood in different ways. For some women, it was primarily religious, a sincere honoring of gods they believed in. For others, it was social, a chance to gather with other women away from male supervision. For still others, it was emotional, a culturally sanctioned way to grieve losses that had nothing to do with ancient myths, but everything to do with their own lives. What's clear is that the Adonia mattered. It persisted for centuries, spread across cultures, inspired art and literature, and gave generations of women a ritual framework for processing experiences that might otherwise have gone unacknowledged. In honoring Aphrodite's grief for Adonis, they honored their own griefs. In mourning a mythical, beautiful youth cut down too soon, they mourned the losses in their own lives, children who died, husbands killed in war, lovers separated by circumstance, the slow death of youth and beauty and hope. The festival kept the story alive, ensured that Adonis and Aphrodite would be remembered not just as characters in myths told by poets, but as presences in lived religious experience, as gods who understood human suffering because they had suffered themselves. Legacy, the eternal youth in art and memory. The story of Adonis and Aphrodite has proven remarkably durable, surviving the transition from oral tradition to written literature, from ancient paganism to modern secular culture, from religious ritual to artistic inspiration. The myth has been retold, reimagined, and reinterpreted for more than 2,000 years, each generation finding in it something that speaks to their own experiences and concerns. In ancient art, Adonis appears most often in two contexts: as the beautiful youth beloved by Aphrodite, shown in intimate scenes with the goddess, or as the dying hunter, shown wounded by the boar, with Aphrodite rushing to his side. Greek vase paintings depict him as the ideal of masculine beauty, young and beardless, with a physique that balanced strength and grace. He often appears nearly naked, or wearing only a short hunting tunic, emphasizing his physical perfection. Aphrodite is usually shown richly dressed and adorned. The contrast between her elaborate beauty and his natural beauty, creating visual tension that mirrors the tension in their relationship. Goddess and mortal, divine and earthly, eternal and fleeting. Roman artists inherited these themes and elaborated on them. They created elaborate sarcophagi carved with scenes from Adonis's life, his miraculous birth from the myrrh tree, his upbringing by Persephone, his hunts with Aphrodite, called Venus in Roman tradition, and his death. These sarcophagi were commissioned by wealthy Romans who wanted to be buried with imagery that spoke to themes of beauty, youth, tragic death, and the possibility of some form of return or renewal. The myth resonated with Roman concerns about mortality and legacy, about leaving something beautiful behind, even though the person themselves was gone. In the Middle Ages, when classical mythology was viewed through a Christian lens, Adonis became a more complex figure. Medieval scholars who preserved and commented on ancient texts sometimes interpreted him as a symbol of physical beauty without spiritual substance, a warning about the dangers of loving the body rather than the soul. His death became a punishment for excessive attachment to worldly pleasure. This interpretation, while common, rather missed the point of the original myth, which was never about punishment, but about the inevitable tragedy of mortal existence and the pain of loving something you know you'll lose. But not all medieval treatments of the myth were so moralistic. Poets writing in vernacular languages, creating romances for courtly audiences, found in Adonis and Aphrodite a template for impossible love, for relationships that transcend social boundaries, for the nobility of loving faithfully, even when that love brings suffering. The medieval tradition of courtly love, with its emphasis on devotion to an idealized beloved, its acceptance of suffering as proof of true love, its celebration of passion that exists apart from marriage, owed something to myths like this one. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical mythology and a return to appreciating the stories on their own terms, rather than forcing Christian interpretations onto them. Artists like Titian, Rubens, and Poussin painted scenes from the Adonis myth, creating works that emphasized sensuality, beauty, and dramatic emotion. Titian's series of paintings showing Venus, Aphrodite, trying to prevent Adonis from going hunting, captures the moment of premonition before tragedy. The goddess, clinging to her lover while he pulls away, eager for the hunt, blind to the danger she clearly sees. These Renaissance paintings often focused on the bodies of the protagonists. Adonis's muscular back as he turns away, Aphrodite's desperate embrace, the physical nature of their connection. This wasn't just about eroticism, though that was certainly present. It was about emphasizing the incarnate nature of their love, the fact that it existed in bodies that could touch and be touched, that could feel pleasure and pain, that could bleed and die. The painting made visible what the myth had always implied, that love is embodied, that it exists in the physical world, that it's vulnerable to all the accidents and violence that flesh is heir to. In literature, Shakespeare wrote Venus and Adonis, a long narrative poem that was actually his first published work, appearing in 1593. Shakespeare's version is both faithful to the myth's basic structure and innovative in its characterization. His Venus is comically aggressive in her pursuit of Adonis, almost embarrassingly forward in expressing her desire, while his Adonis is curiously cold and resistant, more interested in hunting than in the goddess offering herself to him. Shakespeare's poem emphasizes the reversal of expected gender roles. Here it's the female who pursues, while the male resists. The woman who burns with passion, while the man remains chaste. But the poem also captures something profound about desire itself, about how we often want most intensely what we cannot have, how resistance can inflame attraction, how the one who loves less holds all the power in the relationship. Shakespeare's Venus is powerful in every way except the one that matters. She cannot make Adonis love her back with the same intensity she feels for him. When Adonis dies in Shakespeare's version, killed by the boar despite all of Venus's warnings, her grief transforms into a curse upon love itself. She declares that from that moment forward, love will always be mixed with pain, that no love will be simple or straightforward, that all lovers will face obstacles and suffering. It's a powerful ending that suggests the myth doesn't just explain flowers or seasons, but explains something fundamental about why love is so difficult, so fraught with complication and sorrow. In the Romantic period, poets like Keats, Shelley, and Byron returned to the Adonis myth with new urgency. They saw in Adonis a figure for the poet himself, beautiful, doomed, cut down in youth by forces beyond his control. When Keats wrote Endymion, Though technically about a different mythological figure, he drew heavily on the same themes. A mortal of exceptional beauty, beloved by a goddess. The impossibility of mortal and divine love. The tragedy of youth destroyed before it could fully flower. Shelley explicitly connected the Adonis myth to contemporary loss when he wrote Adonis, an elegy for Keats who had died young at age 25. Shelley transformed Keats into Adonis, killed not by a bore, but by harsh criticism from reviewers that Shelley believed had hastened his friend's death. The poem begins in deep mourning. I weep for Adonis, he is dead, but gradually moves toward a kind of transcendent acceptance, suggesting that Adonis, Keats, has become one with eternal beauty, that his death was really a transformation into something that could never fade or age. This romantic interpretation introduced a new element to the myth. The idea that Adonis's death somehow preserved his beauty permanently, that by dying young, he achieved a kind of immortality through never aging, never declining, never losing the perfection that made him special. This was a significant shift from the ancient version, which saw his death as tragedy, pure and simple, without consolation. The Romantics, uncomfortable with meaningless tragedy, tried to redeem it by suggesting that early death had its own value, that there was something beautiful about dying at one's peak. Modern psychology has found in the Adonis myth a rich source of symbols and interpretations. Freudian analysts saw it as dealing with themes of castration anxiety, the son's competition with the father, and the dangerous power of female sexuality. Jungian interpreters read Adonis as an archetype of the divine youth, the puer aeternus, who represents potential and promise but lacks the maturity to fully realize them. His death becomes a necessary sacrifice, a way for youth to be transformed into something more lasting, more integrated into the cycle of life. Feminist scholars have focused on Aphrodite's role, seeing in her story an exploration of female desire and the particular grief that comes from loving someone over whom you have no real power. Despite being a goddess, despite being the literal embodiment of love and beauty, Aphrodite cannot protect Adonis from death. Her divine power, unlimited in so many ways, stops at the boundary between life and death. This powerlessness resonates with women's experiences across cultures and time periods. The inability to protect those we love, the grief of watching them make choices we know will hurt them, the special agony of standing by helplessly while someone we love dies. In contemporary popular culture, the Adonis myth appears in various forms, though often simplified or fragmented. The name Adonis has become synonymous with masculine beauty, used to describe any exceptionally handsome man. The phrase "gardens of Adonis" appears in literary contexts as a metaphor for things that look promising, but lack lasting substance. Roses remain associated with passionate love, though most people who give or receive them have no idea why. Young adult fiction has discovered the myth as well, reimagining it for modern audiences. Some versions make Adonis a willing sacrifice, choosing to die to ensure the changing seasons. Others turn Aphrodite into a tragic villain whose possessiveness leads to Adonis's death. Still, others modernize the setting, making Adonis and Aphrodite contemporary figures whose love affair plays out against urban backgrounds, with cars replacing boars and hospitals replacing forest clearings. What makes the myth endure? Why does this story, first told thousands of years ago in a culture radically different from our own, still resonate? Perhaps it's because the myth captures something universally true about love, that it makes us vulnerable, that caring deeply about another person means accepting the possibility of losing them, that the most beautiful relationships are often the most fragile. We all know what it's like to love something that won't last, whether that's a person whose life will end, a phase of life that will pass, or simply a feeling that we know will fade with time. The myth also speaks to our complicated relationship with beauty. We're drawn to beautiful things, beautiful people, but we also know that beauty is temporary. We age. Bodies change. The most striking features eventually sag and wrinkle and lose their power to make hearts race. Adonis, dying young at the height of his beauty, represents both the tragedy and the preservation of beauty. He never gets old, never becomes less than he was, but the cost of that eternal youth is death itself. And there's something profound in the idea that grief can create beauty, that from blood and tears can grow flowers. It suggests that loss is not simply destructive, that suffering can be transformed into something meaningful, that pain has purpose even if we can't always see it in the moment. The anemones and roses don't erase the tragedy of Adonis's death. They don't bring him back or undo Aphrodite's grief, but they ensure that the love and the loss will be remembered, that something beautiful remains even after everything else is gone. The myth acknowledges that life is tragic. People die. Love ends. Beautiful things break. These are facts that no amount of divine power can change, truths that even gods must accept. But the myth also insists that these facts don't make love meaningless or foolish. Aphrodite loved Adonis, knowing he was mortal, knowing their time together would be limited. She loved him anyway. And when he died, her grief was real and deep and transformative. That's the lesson, if myths have lessons, that it's worth loving even when you know you'll lose what you love. That the pain of loss doesn't diminish the beauty of what you had. That caring deeply about something temporary is not a mistake, but perhaps the most human thing we can do. That grief, properly honored, can create something new, not a replacement for what was lost, but a memorial that keeps the lost thing alive in memory and meaning. The ancient Greeks, who told this story around fires and taught it to their children and reenacted it in their festivals, understood this. They lived in a world where death was ever present, where children died in infancy, where women died in childbirth, where young men died in wars, where disease and accident and violence could take anyone at any time. They couldn't insulate themselves from loss the way we sometimes try to. They couldn't pretend it wouldn't happen to them. So instead, they told stories, like this one. Stories that said, yes, love ends, but love matters. Yes, beautiful things die, but they leave beauty behind. Yes, grief is real and deep and transformative, but it's also proof that you loved truly, that you let yourself be vulnerable enough to be hurt by loss. Aphrodite, weeping over Adonis's body in that forest clearing, her divine beauty marred by tears and blood and dirt, is perhaps more truly herself than she ever was when perfectly arranged on her throne on Olympus. In that moment of raw grief, she's not the goddess of love in the abstract. She's love incarnate, experiencing what all lovers eventually experience, the knowledge that nothing lasts forever, that even the most perfect union will end, that death parts everyone eventually. But she's also proof that love survives loss. She goes on. She continues to be the goddess of love, continues to inspire passion in others, continues to exist in a world that no longer contains Adonis as he was. The flowers bloom. The seasons change. Life somehow continues. And in those moments, each spring, when the anemones push up through the earth, when roses unfurl their red petals, when the air warms and the world comes back to life after winter's death, the ancient Greeks would remember. They would remember Adonis's beauty and his tragic end. They would remember Aphrodite's grief and her enduring love. They would remember that loss and beauty are intertwined, that the most precious things are often the most fragile. That love means accepting the inevitability of grief. They would remember, and they would live anyway, and they would love anyway, because what else is there to do? You can avoid love to avoid grief, but then you've avoided the best parts of life along with the worst. You can refuse to care about beauty because it fades, but then you've denied yourself the joy of experiencing beauty while it lasts. You can try to protect yourself from loss by never allowing yourself to gain anything worth losing. But that's not protection. That's just a different kind of death, slower, but no less final. Better, the myth seems to say, to be like Aphrodite, to love completely, even knowing it will hurt, to treasure beauty, even knowing it's temporary, to grieve deeply, because the depth of grief reflects the height of love, to let that grief transform into something that can be shared, something that might help others understand their own losses, something that blooms and scatters and returns year after year, as long as the earth itself endures. That's the gift of Adonis and Aphrodite's story. Not comfort, exactly, and not answers to the hardest questions about why beautiful things die, and why love must end, and why we have to lose the people we care about most, but recognition, acknowledgement, the knowledge that these feelings we have, these griefs we carry, these losses that reshape us, they're not new, they're not unique, they're as old as humanity, as old as the gods themselves. And if a goddess could love a mortal man, knowing from the beginning that he would die and leave her grieving, if she could consider that love worth the inevitable pain, if she could transform her grief into flowers that would remind everyone who saw them that beauty and loss and love are inseparable, then perhaps we can find the courage to do the same. Perhaps we can love the temporary things, the fragile things, the things we know we'll lose. Perhaps we can let ourselves be changed by loss rather than destroyed by it. Perhaps we can create something beautiful from our grief, something that might help someone else who's grieving in their turn. Perhaps, like the anemones, we can bloom briefly and intensely and scatter on the wind and return and bloom again. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's everything. The myth of Adonis and Aphrodite doesn't promise happy endings. It doesn't claim that love conquers death, or that faith will be rewarded, or that justice will prevail. It's more honest than that. It says that love and death are both real, both powerful, both unavoidable. It says that beauty matters even though it fades. It says that grief is the price of love, and it's a price worth paying. And every spring, when the first anemones bloom and the roses begin to unfurl their petals, the story tells itself again without words. The flowers remember what we sometimes forget, that the most beautiful love story ever told was also the most tragic. And that's not a contradiction. That's the truth. If you enjoyed this journey through one of mythology's most beautiful and heartbreaking love stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Myths of the Night. There are countless other tales from Greek mythology and beyond waiting to be explored. Stories of love and loss, of heroes and monsters, of gods and mortals whose lives intertwined in ways that still echo through our culture today. Each myth is a window into how ancient peoples understood the world, how they made sense of the forces that shaped their lives, how they processed emotions that are still universal thousands of years later. By exploring these stories together, we connect not just with the past, but with the fundamental experiences that make us human: love, grief, beauty, death, and the desperate hope that our lives might mean something beyond the brief span of years we're given. So join me next time as we delve into another myth, another world, another story that has survived centuries to reach us here and now. Until then, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with beauty that blooms eternal, even in the darkest places.